Where do monsters come from? It's a simple question, but the answer changes a lot between fictions, and choosing one or two methods of origin tends to be how most of a setting's monster population gets creative and can greatly impact how a story goes. So for example, some monsters are simply creatures we aren't familiar with. Star Wars, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and a good chunk of D&D does this. When this happens, a monster is more or less an animal that is simply foreign to us, the viewer, which can sometimes result in an awkward dissonance. I'd argue a good chunk of monstrosities in D&D could be argued as beasts within the context of I am a person in this world where this is just a thing that exists, which for unattentive players has resulted in confusion a few times when I've run the game, because why would speak with animals not work on this weird sand shark thingy? I find this method works best in a broad world where the monsters aren't seeking out your death, but let's contrast that for a moment with all the monsters come from a single evil source. A good recent example would be the new Legend of Zelda game, where it's revealed that the Demon King gained power and made all of the monster population as one of its first actions. But there's plenty of stuff where you have like just some pit that they all come from, or some single source that all of this stuff pops out of. I find this method works great for storytelling with a focused, larger-than-life foe, like a very big one, very powerful, that you have to go and build yourself up to fight. I don't normally use it for D&D, but it runs fine. You just have to have your objective set from the beginning. I'd use the Curse of Strahd as an example, because Strahd is very directly the source of almost everything you can find in that module. Though both of these come with a pretty wide scope, and you could also make your scope a lot more narrow. I had an old book outline I never finished writing because, let's face it, everyone does, I really liked, where I scrapped at the general monster stuff and I just said lycanthropes will be the only monster form here. That is the werewolves, werebat, werebear, werefox. Just any animal has a lichen form, and that is the biggest danger in the setting. There's no other monsters that you can deal with. This has a neat effect of helps contrast it against how one might perceive a general fantasy setting, and it helped a lot with keeping the magic system controlled and the world building concrete, because now everyone's concerned about this threat that looms in the wilderness around their homes. It made silver more valuable than gold within the setting, and it set up everything really neatly. I made the protagonist of that one also was a transmutation wizard, so what he would do is he would be able to temporarily turn weapons that are made of iron, steel, wood into silver, and that allowed him to build up mobs to fight Lycan forces. Another fun one is the one monster system. This is most common in horror, but it boils down to these monsters just not being a common occurrence. Only a few of these exist, and each additional one runs the risk of cheapening the impact of the others. You might think about the first Alien or the first Predator movie, where the only being the audience knew of had a lot of impact, but then in some of the subsequent ones you see that there's a bunch of them and they kind of have diminishing returns. So no one in the setting is familiar with the Predator, and that's fine, and it allows them to have a much higher mystery level, but everyone knows what Goblin is in a Goblin setting. Not to say a one monster system can't coexist within a fantasy setting, it just means that they have a more unique origin whenever you're in a fantasy setting. Which brings me to what I would argue is the most common origin of a monster, just a story. You set up a story, and that story is why that exists. A tale of how this thing came to be, which can be hard to explain organically sometimes. You get the stilted exposition you see every once in a while. I split these into a few categories. The first will be the divine monster, a deity in normally a polytheistic setting, makes whatever the thing you're talking about is. Lord of the Rings did this with the elves and the dwarves and the whatever, and in Greek myths this often would be a punishment for some mortal that's screwed with the monsters. For a fun example, Hera from Greek myths sent a giant snake named Python to chase one of the women Zeus reproduced with because she was really mad. And that was how pythons came to be in Greek mythology generally. But another fun origin is the self-made monsters. These can be a tad tragic, but we start with someone who is normal, or at least mostly normal, and we introduce a flaw that gradually turns them into a monster. I think of Norse mythology where greed turned a dude into a dragon, and that's how dragons exist in there. But we can can go more specific for a mage or a wizard looking to enhance their form, being how most liches are made. Weirdly, this is also a supervillain origin. In some of the Spider-Man comics, you got Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, Lizard, and probably 6 others. Another weird example that sticks in my head is Kurtz from an old book, The Heart of Darkness. I wouldn't recommend the book, but I've also read it enough times that I think the villain's really cool. He was a human, technically, but he was more of a voice within the setting, like this presence that you can't really define. And everyone who knew him in the book loved him, even though he was kind of mysterious, creepy, ugly, all those things, but his just presence had that effect on people. The story involves some colonialism, and he was so persuasive he just went into Africa and he convinced one of the native tribes that he was a god. Toward the end, this character is described as a soul that knew no restraint, no fear, no faith, and he was just struggling blindly with himself. He kind of stuck because it's like he had the full potential to be whatever he wanted, and he became a monster within the story. And lastly, we got the man-made monsters. This is a monster that was made by a specific figure, but also comes with a different annotation than deity ones, because normally man-made monsters are grosser in a setting. Creation isn't something a lot of stories say people should be screwing with. My first instinct is to cite the Frankenstein monster, but I haven't really read that one, and I also never bothered to watch those movies. So instead, I will be bringing up Full Metal Alchemist, because every monster in that show had to be crafted. My personal favorite is the Butcher Fellow, who was a man locked in armor. He would have been normal, but then he was given this near immortal form. And in D&D, this variety is most likely to be wizard made, so I'll point to the Owlbear, the Flesh Golem, both of which were designed by wizards but then got out of hand and are now just a nuisance throughout the world. So what was the point of all this? I like monsters and I just wanted to talk about it. Thank you for your time. I'd love to read your thoughts on different monster types and origins in the comments.